Well, let's get into that. My apologies to anyone who asked a question and then didn't hear back from me for over a month. Also sorry to anyone who's been waiting for a video in general. I don't mean to flex, but I kind of been swamped with work. I have a job. On top of that, I've been doing freelance animation for the past few weeks, and that's kind of been eating up a lot of my time and creative juices. But in any case, I hope this is a helpful video. Thanks for watching. There are 3 programs that I use on a regular basis. Number 1, Photoshop. Number 2, MS Paint. And number 3, Flash, which I use for animations. I also started using Procreate a lot more regularly since I first edited this part of the video. No, I do not go to art school. I was very full of myself and only applied to one animation school with full confidence that I would get in, and I didn't. Oh, I did go to a art high school, if that's what you meant. So, anatomy is one of the areas where I feel like I can't really talk with any degree of authority since my anatomy is pretty janky. My art is decent overall, but to anyone out there with an actual understanding of how the human body works and how things like muscles are, then it's pretty clear that I'm just guessing most of the time. I learned anatomy, learned in quotations, essentially by just looking at people and drawing them as closely as I could. Life drawing, photo studies, that kind of thing. But if you're more into stylized art or like semi-realism, cartoons, that kind of thing, it's just as helpful to... I heard a coy wolf. Anyway, it's just as helpful to study other artists' work and try and figure out how they approach anatomy. And then after a couple of years of doing this, you start to notice things that make your drawings look more accurate. That's pretty much it. You just pick it up as you go. I know this is definitely not the best way to learn, as it's almost entirely trial and error. So if you want to speed run getting good at anatomy, I would suggest looking at actual anatomy, like medical diagrams and stuff, where it actually shows the skeleton and what it looks like, and all the muscles and how they fall and connect into one another, that kind of thing. That way you can actually know what it is you're drawing, rather than just guessing until you get it right one day. I personally find when it comes to drawing, it's not always necessary to get every single tendon and muscle fiber to be 100% accurate. I mean, of course it can be if you're into like hyper-realism or something, but for my needs, I find it's much more useful to look into figuring out the major shapes of a person and what those shapes look like in relation to each other. For instance, you look at a person and try to see what percentage of their height do their legs take up, and then what about their torso? Where do the tips of their fingers end on their legs if they're standing in a neutral position with their arms at their side? That kind of thing. And of course, once you figure out these ratios or your interpretation of them, you can mess around and change them however you want to exaggerate certain features. But I don't know, I think it's helpful to know what it is you're changing first. So hands. You got like a palm usually. Then you got fingers, if you're lucky. You got your fat area where the thumb goes, and then you got the thumb also where the thumb goes. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear that live commentary is not my strong suit, so I'm gonna go ahead and take the reins and voiceover here. When you're starting out, I find it helps to break hands down into the basic shapes. You got the palm, the thumb lump, and then the finger splay. This gets a lot more complicated as soon as you start getting ambitious with the pose, introducing foreshortening and perspective and that kind of thing. So I guess my main tip for hands is to take full advantage of the fact that you have some, assuming you have some, and use your own hands to make the poses you're trying to draw in real life. You can take reference pictures or just look at them as you're drawing. And there's also the internet, which has hundreds of references, both of real life photos and of other people's drawings of hands. So besides that, the best advice I can give is draw a lot of hands. A lot of people just put the arms behind the back in the pockets or whatever and avoid them, but that's not really helpful. So yeah, draw a bunch of hands in a bunch of different styles, and maybe consult someone who's better than me for proper tips. This may sound obvious, but shading is all about the values. If you're wanting to learn about shading, I would advise doing some studies of drawings without color, like in black and white. Or at the very least, if you're doing a drawing in color, you turn it off at multiple points, like set it to grayscale, just to check your values. It's important to imagine what you're drawing in a 3D space and to kind of think about which areas the light will reach. The closer the surface to the light source, the more illumination. It's also important to consider what things will block the light and create cast shadows. Yeah? When it comes to line art, basically the only way I can get it to look good is to redraw every line over and over until I get it right. It helps to make sure you don't do too much while zoomed in, so you can make sure the area you're working on fits in with the rest of the drawing. I also like to use a brush with a little bit of texture, because it can help drawing attention away from any tiny imperfections, which are more noticeable with a perfectly smooth line. Similarly to anatomy, my understanding of color theory is very heavily vibes-based. Currently anything I do digitally, I'll render out the whole thing and then spend the last 10% of the drawing process just messing around with the colors, gradient maps, overlays, that kind of thing, just until everything starts looking good. One thing I like to consider is what parts of the drawing you want to bring attention to, and then you can kind of use color to separate that part from everything else. So an extreme example of this would be if you've ever seen those young adult novels with the black and white photography as the cover, but then like one part of the image has been edited to be like red or blue or something. It's usually a iris or a flower or whatever. Those are pretty cheesy, but the concept is the same. Since everything's black and white, your eye is immediately drawn to the thing that's in color. So, say you want to draw a character who's got like very vibrantly colored clothes. It's probably not the best idea to make the background just as saturated and colorful. So maybe a better solution there would be to make the background more neutral color, something more muted, so that way the clothing will stand out. And there's many ways to do the same thing. Rather than just saturated versus desaturated, you could have something cool versus warm, something light versus dark. We're kind of getting beyond color here, but detailed versus simple, in focus versus blurred. Essentially, you want to keep your drawing balanced rather than overly cluttered or too much of one thing to the point where it all blends together. You can learn about like the proper terms for color schemes if you want. I kind of only ever consciously use complementary or analogous color schemes, and other than that I just wing it. I also personally find it helpful to look at paintings or photos that have good color schemes and try and use those colors in your own drawings. Again, sorry if that wasn't entirely helpful. I'm not an expert. Don't be surprised if your art doesn't look the way you wanted to when you first switch from traditional to digital. In the same way you would have a learning curve if you've only ever drawn with pencils, for instance, and you jump straight into oil paints for the first time. You're not going to know what you're doing. They're completely different mediums, and it's going to take a while to figure it out. There's plenty of resources online where people share their processes, and when you mix that with your own experimenting, you can kind of piece together how to take advantage of the medium. Digital has its pros, like being able to undo easily, separating your work onto different layers, being able to alter what you've already done with little effort. But it also has its drawbacks if you're used to working traditionally. Like, with digital, there's no tooth to the surface you're working on. It's like drawing on glass or plastic. It's also more difficult to produce natural-looking brushwork or textures. And as you can kind of see from my early dives into digital art, it takes a lot of getting used to in order to be able to get your comfort level to the point where you're able to draw the same quality of work regardless of whether it's digital or traditional. So essentially my advice is don't feel bad if it feels like your skill level drops suddenly when you start working digitally. It just takes a while to get used to. You gotta keep practicing and figure it out. Thank you. The phrasing of this is throwing me off a little bit. Is it okay to have fears and doubts? I mean, obviously it's okay to feel whatever you feel, but at the same time, it's not like I'm saying fear and doubt is something you want to strive for. Rather than okay, I would say it's normal, something a lot of people have to work through. I mean, if given the option, I would definitely choose to not have them. I'm sorry, I don't really know how to answer this one. I'm very sorry to hear that. Sheesh, haven't really got the time outside of making YouTube videos and personal drawings that I post on my Instagram. I'm just kind of busy working. This is a bit of an interesting one since finding motivation to draw was never really an issue for me. I just started drawing because it was fun, and I continued to do it because it continued to be fun. It was kind of what I would do when I didn't want to do anything else or I was bored. And I guess as I got older, I started actively trying to get better more. The thing about learning to draw is it's the same as learning anything ever. Anyone can do it in theory, but the secret ingredient is you have to actually like doing it. At the end of the day, you're not going to be good at drawing right out the gate. You're going to have to draw a lot of ugly stuff before you figure out how to draw good stuff. That's just how it goes. So if making hundreds, if not thousands, of ugly drawings sounds unappealing to you, you're probably going to have a hard time finding motivation. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is I got motivation to draw because I thought it was cool. I would look at other people's drawings and I would think, hey, that's pretty cool. I want to do that. And so I did. Of course, there's times where you don't have the energy to draw, or if you do try to draw, everything doesn't look right and it kind of feels like you've forgotten how. But I don't find it takes very long to get those juices flowing again. Maybe a couple of days sometimes, maybe a week. But I always end up coming back to it because it's what I like to do. So ultimately, I continue to do it. Hey, bop-da-boop-boo. Kinda. Not to be racist, of course. If you're Italian, big fan of spaghetti. Yeah, see, this is like the times when I question whether I'm qualified to be teaching anything, because I feel like so much of what I do is just like redrawing something until it looks not so bad. So there's a tip for you, redraw it until it looks not so bad.